Hey, greetings, this is Fred in Alaska. Thanks for joining me today. What I wanted to share with you, well, first, they're getting the hat design worked out. There's something with the programming with Teespring or whatever. I'll let you guys know when that's available. What I wanted to share with you, we'll just call him the trapper. He quit trapping about 25 years ago, roughly, because of this incident. Where he trapped was near the Kuskokwim River. Well, he had been there many years. He said 20 plus years at that time, and he had a few different areas that he would trap. But the last place he was in, he had roughly he said about a 10-mile big oval loop where he'd have his sets off the snow machine trail. Had himself a little Tundra, a little Ski-Doo Tundra. Excellent workhorse little snow machine. Anyway, he had doing his thing. He was into his season a couple weeks. He was doing really well, and then for a spell of about 3 to 4 days, nothing. Some of his traps were sprung. No sign of anything. Didn't see any tracks of anything. It was really weird. He did notice some of the areas where the traps were sprung. It looked like someone had taken a spruce bough and kind of scrubbed the snow to clear up any tracks. And he thought, oh, well, that's weird. You know, another trapper would just steal and go away. That whoever is doing this is attempting to hide their tracks. So after a few days of that and him picking up on little things, it was just getting dark, and as he was coming back towards his cabin, he had a little bit of a rise on his left-hand side, and the trees got thicker as it went up, and as he went back into this little valley, it got thicker with trees, and that's where he had his cabin. Nice tucked out of the wind and the weather for the most part. So as he's going back into this little kind of like a box valley, a real small valley, not very big, where he had his cabin, he said he was noticing some movement up on that little rise off to his left. So he kept looking over, but it was just dark enough he couldn't make anything out. And so he got a real spooky feeling, and the only thing he carried with him was a 22 mag. He had other guns in the cabin, but he carried the 22 Magnum to dispatch any still live small game fur bearers, because he really didn't need any more than that, and he wasn't out to damage the fur. He was trying to make money. So what he does is he loops around, goes all the way back out, comes back in, and is basically breaking trail on one of his older trails that kind of went up onto that rise that he used to use but stopped using a couple years before because it was getting overgrown and he wasn't wanting to mess with it. But he decided he's gonna go up there and take a look at that movement he saw, because he just got an eerie feeling about it, but he had to check it out. So he's going on up there, and he's basically breaking trail on this little Tundra. And they're great workhorses, but they're not the best trail breaking sleds. It takes a while because they get stuck kind of easy sometimes, because they got nothing for traction on those things. They're basically a good trail sled. So anyway, great on gas though. Super lightweight, you could throw them around. Anyway, so he's basically crunching, breaking trail, and he gets to a spot where all the willows were, and he noticed looked like tracks going through there, and now it's getting dark. So he grabs his flashlight out of his sled, he turns on the old mag light, you know, clicks it on, and he had one of the police style ones that took 4D batteries, so it lasted a little longer, maybe 5 minutes longer than the 3 one. So anyway, he's beaming around, he's looking, not seeing nothing, because his headlight on the snow machine only worked when the thing was running, and it wasn't that bright. It was kind of yellowed out with age. So he's beaming around looking at these tracks, and he can't make them out. And where he's breaking trail, as soon as he steps off the snow machine and stuff, he's down almost to his up to his hips in snow. So he's like, well, shit. So he kind of looks around, he goes, I'll come back, do it again tomorrow. So he works, and as he's getting the snow machine kind of huffed around, grabbing it by the skis, tossing one way, taking the tracks and so on to turn it around 180 degrees. Just as he's about done, he kind of sinks into the one side on his, he said he was leaning on his left, and he remembers looking and watching the sled where the 22 Magnum was leaned up, the gun slid down, and he thought, shit. Well, it was on his mind, these tracks. Now, as he's fighting around, he was hearing these noises. And so once he fell over on his left, the noises came into the forefront of his mind, and he was thinking, well, I want that gun closer to me. So watching it fall over basically reminded him he wanted that a little closer. So he gets up, he's looking around trying to figure out why and where these weird noises. He said it was almost like a squirrel bark, but just single. Squirrels, they'll usually, you know, bark deet, 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 deet. I'm not good at it, but multiple times. This was just once and then stop, once and then stop. So you get these little barks over and over again, but he said it sounded like it was coming from different areas, but couldn't pinpoint it. So now it's getting in the dark, and when he's sitting there just going over these things in his mind, he gets that overwhelming dread feeling again. So, you know, I asked him, well, you know, with it getting dark, how'd you notice the gun slide down in the sled or whatever? And he said because the twilight of the rise he was on, at the angle he was at, it was twilight in the background. He saw the shadow of it, and he saw it because I was curious about that myself. Anyway, I digress. So he jumps up, he works his way back to the sled. He gets the 22 Magnum, slings it over his shoulder. It was like a Ruger 1022. And so he slings it over his shoulder, so he has it on him. And he's basically straightened out enough, and he has to adjust the sled and the rear tracks real quick because they were kind of sinking in, and he didn't want to just, you know, trench out. So he fires up the snow machine, goes back down to the bottom of this rise, hooks around, and comes back up his trail to his cabin. He gets there, uneventful evening. He gets up the next morning, and he's kind of plotting because on his table he had a map of his personal little area and little markers. This was good this year, that, you know, and so on, just his own tracking system. So he decides, I'm going to move some of these sets that have been triggered, leave that area alone, and move them to a different spot along my track. So as he's plotting that the next morning, drinking coffee or whatever, just waiting for it to just warm up a hair, because I think it was -10 at this point, and he knew it would go up a little bit after the sun came up a little ways. So, excuse me, he gets all his gear together and everything, and he upgrades to his 270, more powerful firearm, straight shooting his shit. I've dropped moose with them before with headshots, but anyway, it's a decent round. So it had a little more oomph than the 22 mag for sure, and so he brought that with him that day. So he fires up the snow machine, he's letting it warm up, and anyone who's warmed up a snow machine, sometimes you got to fight them until they're idling on their own, you know, you got to feather the throttle. And so as he's doing that, you know, he's giving it a little gas, and every time he gives it gas, that light works on the magneto. So the more engine rev you got, the brighter the light will be. So his light is kind of pulsating with the motor as he's warming it up, right? So as this pulsating yellowish light is hitting the parameter of his area he had cleared for his cabin, he notices movement out of the corner of his eye again. And he's trying to focus on it, so he's still feathering the throttle, he's making sure he's not seeing anything, and he digs around the back of his little hatch on the back, kind of has a Velcro thing, you unstrap it, his little cubby area in the seat. That's where he had his mag light. So he digs it out as he's feathering the throttle, and he beams over to where he saw the movement. There's nothing. So he's just kind of shaking his head like, yeah, you're just spooked. You're just by yourself, you're spooked, just calm down, nothing to worry about. So he continues warming up the snow machine, and once he's satisfied it's not going to stall out, he lets it just idle on its own and goes back into the cabin. Now, when he gets back into the cabin, he's getting himself, he always brings, you know, hatchet, chainsaw, fresh traps, things of this nature. So he's bringing stuff out in 5-gallon buckets and putting it in his sled. Now, on his second trip into the cabin, as he's coming up to the door, because he said as you approach the cabin, the door was on the left-hand side as you're facing, and he had like a 4x6 type window that he kind of piecemealed together. Basically a bunch of smaller windows in a 4x6 area is what it boils down to. So as he's going up to the door, he notices movement up off to his left again, and that's the same area that the rise is on that leads back out away from his cabin where it's at. And so he's feeling really spooked. So he goes inside for a minute, shakes it off. You know, he's like, you're losing it. Come on, you just calm down. You're just out here by yourself, and you know, you're getting yourself worked up. So he's giving himself this pep talk, and he hears this whoop. Well, it wasn't all that concerning. It startled him a little bit, but snow sloughs off the roof and makes a very similar noise, and that's what he chalked it up to. So he chalked it up to the snow on the roof finally sloughing off the side, impacting the ground. So he calms down, kind of laughs at himself for getting paranoid for, in his mind, nothing. Goes back outside, gets on the snow machine, tucks his thermos along with the mag light back into the seat, and takes off down the trail. He said he was about 3 miles into this little 10-mile loop he had worked out, and he found a spot that he saw fresh fur bearer tracks, and he was gonna, you know, put up a set. So he's going over there, and he sets one for a marten, and he sets one for a wolverine a little ways away from it, or potentially a lynx or whatever. So as he's doing that, he said he kept feeling being watched, and kept kind of looking around because it wasn't fully light out yet, and he was kind of still relying on the headlamp a little bit because it was getting lighter, but he just kept feeling watched. So he finishes this thing. He keeps trying to shake. You're just alone. You're spooking yourself. Calm down. He gets back over to the snow machine, restarts it, and he's contemplating calling it a day because this feeling, he can't shake it. It's eating him up. So he decides, okay, I'm just gonna run the rest of this track back to the cabin. You know, if I see a set standing out with a marten hanging, I'll stop and get it. But otherwise, I'm gonna call it a day early and shake off whatever this creepiness is. So he rips on out of there, and as he's going down the trail, he hits a spot where there's a bunch of bumps because it's basically tundra, and after driving over it and then plowing through it, kind of gets ribbed. But these were bigger. So he's kind of boondocking, making his way through this portion, and as he's doing so, the sled catches on something and dumps over, so he has to stop. And he's feeling a little panicked because this is daytime now, and there's plenty of light. He's looked around, he hasn't seen anything, and so he rights his sled, and he's putting the stuff in, just throwing it in. Normally he would put it nicely back in the bucket, no worries or whatever, but he just felt concerned. Gets it all in there, fires up, and takes back off. Now as he's taking back off, he hears something, but with the rev of the motor, it was easy to dismiss, but he said it sounded like a really loud growl. But again, he chalked it up to the engine bogging down, making a little deeper, throatier, you know, exhaust sound or something, and he left it at that. So when he gets back to the cabin, he remembers the sound that sounded like the snow sloughing off the roof. So he goes around to the side where he assumed it had slid off, and all the snow is still in place, all sides of the roof. It hadn't sloughed off at all. So he gathers his stuff, takes it inside, shuts and locks his door, stokes the fire, and just sits by the fireplace staring at his feet, trying to come to grips with why he's feeling this way. He's been out there forever, never felt spooked, was never worried about bears. They weren't out that time of year. You know, everything was going through his mind. He had the 270, the 22 Win Mag, and he also had what the heck was it? Oh, it wasn't the 338. Anyway, he had various caliber rifles, and one was pretty dang large. So he goes after sitting there contemplating, and he gets the larger caliber rifle out and decides, you know, I'm gonna keep this out and just hang around the cabin a couple days. He felt like, in his words, being in the cabin, he felt like he wasn't safe in the cabin. He felt like he needed to hide under somewhere. He needed to scurry away, is the words he used. So he said he never felt like that in his life. Now, as he's talking about, as he's thinking about these things, he's hearing weird noises way off in the distance. He said it sounded like owl hoots, but at that distance, it wouldn't have traveled that far. So for the life of him, he's trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And it's still daylight. Well, Alaskan winter daylight, which doesn't last all that long. Anyway, it's like an extended dusk at some times of the year. I'll give an example here. In a little over a month, it will be the shortest day of the year up here. I'll give you guys an example. Anyway, so as he's trying to decide what to make of these noises and replaying the past few days in his mind, he cannot help himself but think, I don't want to be here. And he loved it there. He'd been there, had kids there, the whole nine. He'd been there forever. His kids grew up trapping with him. So this was home away from home in essence, and he felt it was alien to him all of a sudden. It was it didn't hold the same meaning. It lost its luster, he said, and he doesn't know why. He at that moment, he doesn't know why. He figured out later, but in that moment, it lost its luster. Nothing had the same homey appeal, and he kept feeling this sense of dread. Now, I asked him, was there any cadence to the owl hooting perceived owl hooting, and he said it was random. And he said a couple hours later, as it was starting to taper back off in the twilight again, he heard a similar sound like an owl imitation, but it sounded like it was coming from the back side of the cabin. The only windows was that 4x6 area where he had like 3 or 4 separate type windows piecemeal together, and it wasn't an exact 6x4, 4 inches tall and 6 foot wide, was just the rough opening, and then he had different size windows in there. So that's the only place he had windows. So he had a limited space where he could look out, and so he sits back down because he couldn't see nothing, and he's just trying to think to himself, who would prank me? Who would go out of their way to do this to me, knowing that I'm armed and here alone? And he couldn't think of anything. So as he's sitting there, he hears another kind of sound like the snow sloughing off thing, and he's like, what is that sound? And normally you can hear it directly above your head on the roof as it's sliding off, but he said it sounded like that, but it wasn't coming from directly above his head. It was off at a little bit of a distance, and for the life of him, he couldn't figure it out, and he would hear it periodically, and he was like, what the hell? And so finally, before it got really dark, he got up his courage. He grabbed his .30 caliber, larger caliber rifle and that mag light, and he goes out and goes around towards the backside of his cabin to look around, see what was making that noise. He said about 40 to 50 yards away, in between some of the willows and stuff, he saw some of the taller spruce up on that little bit of a rise, and he saw movement and snow falling off of one of them. And then he sees a figure on another one, and he hears that sound. So what he said he saw was one of these things basically kind of quasi bear hugging and riding down the boughs of a spruce tree to the ground. So it was making this and then boom sound when they impacted the ground. He said he didn't know what he was looking at. He said he went into total shock. He said once he realized what was going on, because none of it made sense in his mind, he couldn't, from what he saw up on the spruce tree and this thing going down, and that he couldn't put it together. He immediately gets back inside. Now it's going on in the darkness, and he's plagued with these, what the hell is that? So he had no curtains over his windows. There was no need. He did have a moose blanket he would hang over when it got like 50 below or some shit like that. But other than that, he had it open. Always have. And so he's sitting there, and he's by his wood stove, and he said he was sipping a little bit of some brandy. And as he's sipping brandy, it's on in the darkness now. He notices something dark move in front of the window. And he said he got a cold sweat immediately. He dropped his little glass of brandy. It was a small little half-quart mason jar that he was drinking out of. He dropped that. It busted on the wood stove when it fell out of his hand because he was kind of in shock at the dark movement. He immediately scrambles over, grabs a mag light, and right in front of that window, he had a wooden bench built into the wall. So, had the rifle, the mag light, and some other various things on there. And so, as he's sitting there trying to figure out what the hell, he grabs a flashlight and he's trying to beam out the window to see what he's dealing with, and he's got his hand on that rifle. Now, something tells him, get away. He said he didn't hear that. It was his feeling he needs to get away from. He's in open view, basically. He needs to take cover, is the feeling he had. So he backs away. He gets over back by the wood stove, and the way the wood stove set off the wall a couple feet on both sides, he got back behind the wood stove, killed his lantern before he did, used the flashlight to see over there, got behind it, squatted down behind the wood stove, and sat there in the darkness. And he said as he was trying to see what anything out the window, because there was the slightest bit of light he could see before it got pitch black, just the slightest, and that was the only reason he was able to see movement. And so as he's sitting there, he's thinking, you're losing your mind. You're losing your mind. Just, you need to pull it together. Maybe you spent too many years out here. He's giving himself a pep talk. So as he's doing so, he notices the movement again. So immediately he flashes. And he says when he turns on the flashlight, this thing wasn't all that big, but it was humanoid in shape. It had a reddish brown hair to it. Really big hands, he said, because it had hands on the windows kind of doing this number, trying to look in. When he beamed it, it looked startled and took off. And he said when it took off, he noticed movement further away from the window take off as well, same direction. Back towards, it would be the right-hand side of the cabin, back up towards where the hill goes up. So immediately he's in shock. He gets over by the window. He's trembling. He couldn't even shoulder the rifle. He was shaking too hard. He's just looking. He hangs up his moose blanket and goes back behind the stove. Still lights out. He said he sat there till the next morning trembling. Didn't even feed the fire. None of that. He stayed still, scared as hell, didn't know what to do. Well, when daylight finally comes the next day, he said he fell asleep for he doesn't know how long. He said probably a handful of hours. Because when he got back up, it wasn't that far from sun going down. He didn't keep watches or clocks or anything for whatever reason. I don't know. He just went by daylight. Anyway, so as he was assessing what he was going to do, he decides, I'm over this. I'm going to go and look for myself. What the hell? Look for tracks, whatever. He gets outside. He looks immediately in front of the window. He said he saw small human-like footprints, and he followed them a little ways, and he noticed further away, about 13, 14 feet outside of that window, there was bigger tracks going the same direction, and it kind of led up towards each other, going off into the trees. And he said when he walked over and saw the bigger tracks and saw they were like humanoid shaped, he knew immediately he didn't want to be there anymore. So he goes back inside the cabin, holds things down overnight. The very next morning, as soon as it was twilight, enough light, he got on a snow machine, hit the Kuskokwim, and got on out of Dodge. He ended up basically gifting that area to a buddy of his that had been interested in the area for a long while. Explained to him everything he saw. Full disclosure, the guy didn't care. He knew it was a good area, and he left it at that. So, just creepy. Being in those situations in the past, wintertime, darkness in a cabin, and stuff happening around you, it's just, the creep factor is just off the chain. Grant you, these appear to be a young one and an older one or something, but again, we weren't there, so we can just go by what he shared with us. hats are coming on the website at some point. They don't have much design features for those hats, so we may have to look into something else in the near future, because I like the embroidery on the brim of my hats myself, but that's just me. All right, well, I'll catch you on the next one.